From Strike King Productions, Dancin' Lessons Video 3, with America's best-known fisherman, Bill Dance.
I'd like to welcome you to my office. There's no other as beautiful. You know, I've been very fortunate over the years making my living fishing. And in the next hour, I'd like to share with you some tips of the trade, which I hope will help you to become a better fisherman and enjoy the great outdoors just a little bit more.
Bill, why should a bass fisherman need to learn about both smallmouth and largemouth if he intends to fish for both? Don't both have roughly the same habits?
Well, each bass is a product of quite a different environment over many centuries. Any bass fisherman who knows how to catch one certainly may catch the other by accident in many cases.
What are the main differences between the two species?
Differences are numerous. Probably the most important ones are that each bass has preferences in most lakes for the places it hangs out, and the basic diet of each differs to some extent from that of the other.
What are the chief differences in the diet?
In the domain of the smallmouth, the list of food available is usually shorter, and the diet is therefore much less varied.
Well, can't the same lures be used for each?
Yes, but the expert at catching each differentiates distinctly in lure choice because of the diet habits of each fish.
Which of the two bass is the most difficult to catch?
Probably the smallmouth. However, the question obscures the basic reason. The largemouth ranges so much more widely and is found in so many more waters that the average angler has far greater opportunity to become better at catching it.
If a fisherman starts out fishing for smallmouth, does he have more or less trouble fishing for the other species, or is it vice versa?
Starting on smallmouth in most cases makes largemouth success come easier than going at it vice versa. The reason is that the smallmouth is more shy and its preferred waters are far more clear.
Describe briefly, if you will, the sort of lake where smallmouth are likely to do well.
A lake that has excellent water quality, that is clear most of the time and usually rocky with sand to gravel on the bottom in some areas.
In your home state, Bill, what lakes are considered to be good smallmouth lakes?
Well, we're blessed with an abundance of great smallmouth lakes here in Tennessee. Some of them would be Pickwick, closest to my home in Memphis, Tennessee. Others would be east of Pickwick, namely Woods Reservoir, Timms Ford Reservoir, Center Hill, Norris, Percy Priest, and of course Dale Hollow, where the world record was caught, a whopping 11-pound, 15-ounce giant.
Bill, name one food item of the smallmouth that would be most important to all to imitate with a lure.
The crawfish. This is because in the majority of smallmouth habitats, the situation is conducive to sustaining a large crawfish population, where, as in some largemouth lakes, crawfish are incidental and numerous other foods more easily available.
Are there preferences regarding the size of lures between the two species?
Largemouth commonly strike lures of large size because they can gulp down large living food, whereas in most smallmouth waters, food items they prefer are much smaller. The bass, used to feeding more daintily, is thus inclined to favor smaller lures. This is not to say that smallmouth can't be caught on larger baits, because they definitely can.
Of the two species, which is the strongest fighter?
Pound for pound, the smallmouth bass may be recognized as the gamest fish around. There's a big difference in bass. Treat this small jaw as an aristocrat. He's highly selective in both living and eating habits and his acrobatic maneuvers.
And what's your favorite?
Take a guess. You know, it seems like every day I'm asked the question, do you prefer bait casting, spin casting, or spinning equipment for freshwater fishing? Well, to be perfectly honest, I've used all three of them. Water clarity, terrain, and lure size usually dictates what I use the most. Usually when I'm fishing gin clear water with very little cover and lure weights of say a 1/4 ounce or less, normally I use spinning. However, my favorite would have to be bait casting over spin casting. And why I say bait casting is because I find it to be the most accurate for pinpoint casting and the most versatile for fighting fish from 1 to 50 pounds without changing rods or line. As to the two shortcomings of bait casting, backlashes and the inability to cast lures less than a 1/4 ounce size. Now here's how I cope with them. Backlashes have almost been erased with the sensitivity of Magforce reels. A smart thumb is still needed, however, as the lure or bait touches down and when casting into a strong wind. Now when casting lighter weight lines and light lures, spinning does an excellent job. Either spin cast or open face spinning. Now, the days of two-piece casting rods that had metal ferrules that were stiff and had a real sloppy feel, well today, modern 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6-piece rods have no ferrules, just precision joints that flex like a one-piece rod. They fold into a 14-inch size for carrying in a car, storing in a boat compartment, a briefcase, or even a suitcase. Now, back to accuracy. Why the stress on pinpoint casting? And why can't it be achieved on spinning or spin casting? Well, it's possible to learn to pinch the line just ahead of the orifice on the spin cast reel and achieve fair accuracy. Just as it is with using the forefinger on the edge of a spinning reel spool, feathering the line, well, which isn't an easy task. Fair accuracy is not enough when fish are hanging into real tight cover or up under it. At times, lures landing a foot off the target won't get the fish, but an inch away will do wonders. All three are available, and you know where you fish and what you like to fish for. So, it's up to you to decide which one of these is best for you. Almost all game fish are cover-oriented, a fact that can present problems for the angler. If, for example, you're faced with several acres of bushes, standing timber, or a quarter-mile stretch of aquatic growth, where do you begin? Well, naturally, any key irregular spot within this mass of cover will be a high-percentage spot, but many times those irregular features aren't there. And when you're faced with this, your catch per hour can be increased by concentrating on any isolated cover. Isolated cover could be a shady spot, a boat dock, a lonely snag, a treetop, a stump, a floating log, a bush, or even a pile of rocks, or whatever, as long as the cover is located in the proper depth of water the fish are using, and located along an otherwise barren stretch of shoreline or lake bottom. These small isolated cover spots act as fish magnets, since nothing else is available to the fish in that immediate area. Fishing these places thoroughly gives a fisherman a high potential for catching fish. Here's a little tip about water clarity that can help you in your selection of lures, colors, your presentation, fish location, their environment, and their peak feeding times. Just how important is water color? Well, to be totally honest, it's extremely important if you want to catch fish. So often, a fisherman takes off to the lake and begins foaming the surface of the water with 10,000 casts using the same plug, the same size and color, regardless of whether the clarity looks like tap water or even like a cup of coffee. More times than not, he returns home tired, upset, frustrated, and nothing to show for all his time and effort. It's very important you understand how water clarity plays in the fish's environment. Then you're on your way to knowing how the fish respond in most bodies of water. I hear fishermen every day say, well, how do you define clear, stained, and muddy water? Well, how clear is clear? Is the lake gin clear, medium clear, or kind of clear? A little confusing, isn't it? Well, under sunny conditions, if I can see a light-colored lure 4 feet or deeper, well, I call that clear. And if I can see the lure between 2 and 4 feet, well, I'll call that stained. And if I can see the lure, say, 2 feet or less, well, I call that muddy. The EPA and the Water Quality Control Board measures water clarity just about the same way. Fish feed heavily by sight in clear water, and in stained water, vision begins to lose its primary importance. And fish use a mixture of sight, smell, and sound to locate their prey. And in muddy water, fish rely mostly on sound and smell. And speaking of sound, this is where they rely heavily on their lateral line to pinpoint movement of prey. It's important to remember fish are tied to their environment and react accordingly. For example, in clear water, fish can see very well and they naturally depend heavily on sight. And you get good light penetration in clear water. You also have to consider these elements. The oxygen's deeper, aquatic growth grows deeper, fish can be caught deeper, fish feed better during lower light, early, late, cloudy days and nights. Fish school and move about more and will chase your offering a lot further. They're more spooky, and in clear water, it will warm and cool much slower. Now, in muddy water, fish can't see very well, and they depend heavily on smell and sound. Also consider that light penetration's bad, low oxygen content in the deeper depths, aquatic growth, well, it's restricted to shallower water. Most fish will be found in shallow water. Fish feed more during the middle part of the day. Fish are more aggressive on sunny days. They scatter more, and fish are more object-oriented. And they don't chase a lure very far, but one good thing, they don't spook as easily. And finally, muddy water will warm up much quicker. Now in stained water, fish are nearest their balancing point. Their behavior can swing either way. As my good friend Al Linder once said, it's an environmental balancing act, and water clarity is the key ingredient. Anglers are often confused when it comes to selecting the proper hooks for their favorite species. And with over 50,000, I do mean that, 50,000 different styles, sizes, and varieties, well, one can get a little confused. Let's take a close look at some ideal hooks for different fish. But first, let's examine the various parts of a fish hook. The two most important dimensions of the hook are made clear: its gap and its throat. Note the width of the gap, the clearance between the point and the shank, and the depth of the throat of the hook. These generous dimensions make for a bigger bite, for deeper penetration of the point, and for better holding power. The weight of the fish is carried high up on the center of the bend, and hooks of this type are ideal for big fish. But for softmouth fish, it's a no-no. Let me show you some of my favorite recommended hook patterns for several different popular species I enjoy fishing for when I'm using live or cut bait or other forms of foodstuff. I mentioned softmouth fish a second ago. Well, I'm referring to the colorful panfish like the crappie and bluegill, which are extremely popular lightweights which provide this fast action and good eating that keep a multitude of anglers happy year-round. For bluegill, my choice in a hook is an Aberdeen extra long shank. Hooks and sizes from number 4, 6 to a number 8. And for crappie, my choice of hooks would be a gold-plated extra fine Aberdeen wire hook in a 1/0 to a 3/0 size. Now when it comes to catching old Mr. Whiskers, the catfish, well, of the 24 different kinds of catfish in the United States, only about a third are large enough to interest anglers. The hook style I normally select for this particular fish is a hook called O'Shaughnessy, and the size will range from a number 4 to a 6/0, depending on what size of cat I'm fishing for. Now when I'm after something really big, like the popular striped bass, that will range in size from 5 to 50 pounds, I select a beak style hook, and the size will vary from a 1/0 to 6/0 depending on the size of the bait and the size of the fish I'm after. Okay, now let's discuss that old fish we call the largemouth bass. As you well know, my favorite way to catch him is to trick him, and that's with artificial bait. But for something different and exciting, live bait such as a wild shiner is hard to beat. Here my choice of hooks are the wide gaps in sizes ranging from 1 to 4/0. It's a funny looking thing, but it really does a good job. For those boys that have sharp teeth like pike, the sauger, and the walleye, I prefer to use a hook with a wider gap that can get around these projections. Although there are several different styles, my favorite is a ring blue sproat in sizes from a number 4 to a 1/0 for walleye and sauger, and for pike I prefer sizes from 1/0 to 6/0. As I stated earlier, there's zillions of hooks on the market, and they all have their place. There are other styles and sizes that can do a fine job, but the hooks I've just shown you, well, they work fine for me, and they're the hooks that I have the most confidence in. Crappie are definitely a fish of all seasons. However, many anglers believe that the hot summer months are the toughest. Well, it can be, but understanding, for the most part, the largest concentrations of crappie are structurally oriented and spend the majority of their lives in open water and relate primarily to break lines. It's very important to remember what I just said, because that's the #1 key to understanding the secrets of this fish. Okay, now, first, I know what you think. What is a break line? Well, a break line is that area on the floor of a lake where there's a rapid or sudden change in depth. The edge of a channel, the edge of a point, the edge of a secondary bank or submerged ridge, or even a high spot where the depth of water changes suddenly or rapidly. For example, an 8-foot depth drops from 8 feet into 20 feet or deeper. Nearly all bodies of water have numerous break lines or drop-off possibilities, and these features are especially good holding areas for crappie during the warm months of June, July, and August. However, a break line in itself will not necessarily hold the crappie. A term that you need to understand is break. A break is that area on a break line that has cover, such as weeds, rocks, bushes, stumps, or other objects. These objects are very attractive to crappie and will hold them most of the time, only if the depth is to their liking. For instance, if you've located an ideal spot like we've been discussing in 20 feet of water and the majority of fish in that area of the lake are in an 8-foot depth pattern, you should concentrate your time fishing the 8-foot break lines in that area instead of the 20-foot break lines. About the only time that crappie are not tied to these deeper water breaks is during the spring when the spawning process is going on, and in bodies of water that remain dingy to muddy the majority of the time. Here, crappie will be found shallow and are extremely object-oriented. The key depth in an area will usually be determined by the amount of food, available light, and the amount of cover present. If the lake water is clear, the crappie will hold below the level of greatest sunlight penetration. The break line depth here could be from 10 to 30 feet. Now in stained water, the crappie would normally be found in depths of 10 feet to 20 feet. And in muddy water, the depth would naturally be shallower, 2 feet to possibly 8 feet. Once you've uncovered the break on that particular break line at the magic depth, you're on your way to catching summertime crappie. When fish are using these type areas, using ultralight gear can be highly productive, only if the terrain will permit and when the crappie are active. But as you well know, the majority of the times that we're on the water, fish are not going to feed all day long. Sure, there's exceptions, but during those inactive times, vertical fishing is one of the best methods of catching them. By vertical fishing, you'll be able to keep your offering in front of the fish or in the strike zone for a much longer period of time. This way, you'll be able to tease him into striking your lure. Like the old saying goes, the longer you can keep your bait in the strike zone, the better the odds of catching the fish. And another saying to add to that is, you first got to establish the depth of this zone. And one of the best ways during the summer months is to establish a pH break line. You'll find that the majority of active fish will be right at the break itself. However, some fish can be caught from the break line to the surface, but as I stated, the most active fish will be right along the edge of the pH break line. With the coming of spring, warming water draws bass into the shallows to feed and spawn, making it the perfect time of the year for both fish and the fishermen. No doubt, spring can be the very best time of the year for the bass man if he knows where and how to look for changes in bass habit patterns. In man-made impoundments and indeed some natural lakes and river tributaries, creek channel coves are ideal spots to look for bass, especially if there's stick-ups, protruding weeds, or grass beds, brush, stumps, or anything unusual or different along the channel of the submerged creek. Remember that bass are cold-blooded, and as the water warms, their metabolism quickens. They burn up energy faster, and they instinctively seek more food. There will be more food in the shallower, warmer water at this time of the year, so naturally, that's where the bass are going to congregate. Protected areas located on the northwest side of a lake is the first place where I begin to look for bass. Northwest coves and protected areas warm quicker because they're exposed to the sunlight longer during the day. Also, early spring cold winds are mostly from the north-northwest, so colder water from the lake's deeper portion is not pushed into these particular areas. In some waterways, the change in bass activity can be very sudden. A couple of warm rains following a tough winter can bring bass into the shallows overnight. Temperature is a tip-off, and having a reliable temp meter at this time of the year will keep the serious bass man a step behind the fish. A few degrees can and will make a big difference. Basically, one can say spring season bass activity occurs in 4 distinct stages. For me, following the fish's habits and behaviors during these separate periods determines fishing methods and helps make fishing much more productive. The early pre-spawn. Individuals or groups of bass begin making short reconnaissance trips into the coves and protected areas. Only when the water temperature stays above 50 degrees for a couple of days will any appreciable number of bass remain there very long. Next is the mid-pre-spawn stage. At about 55 degrees or above, bass leave deeper water hangouts and enter the coves and the protected areas. The majority of these fish will be males. The weather and water temperature are usually unstable during this period and will determine the amount of fish movement. A good area can hold several fish one day and very few fish the next. Now the fish enters a late pre-spawn stage. By the time the water reaches around 60 degrees and becomes more stable, large daily fluctuations of movement in and out of these areas are over. Many early spawners are remaining in the coves. Finally, spawning usually begins when the water temperature stabilizes at about 65 degrees, depending on latitude, and lasts until the water warms above approximately 69 degrees. Bear in mind that not all the bass spawn at the same time, but during this period, about 65 to 70% of them will at some time be entering the spawning grounds. Many new bass anglers, and some veteran fishermen too, think that the majority of fishing lures on the market today are designed to lure fishermen instead of the fish. This misconception is easy to understand considering that most sporting good counters are literally laced with thousands of eye-catching lures in hundreds of fancy exotic colors and every conceivable shape, pattern, and size. Of course, if we could afford to have all these lures available in our tackle box at all times, we'd always be well armed for bass. Unfortunately, this would cost a lot more than most of us can spend on fishing gear. So how can we be prepared to cope with the unexpected, unpredictable habits and desires of Brother Bass and still keep our budget above board? Well, the best method that I've come up with is to tune the lures that I do have available to match a particular situation. And tuning is the best term I can come up with to describe altering or modifying lures to make them work better under prevailing conditions. Now let's discuss a couple, for example, that I've used before, and then I'm sure you can think of a lot of variations that will work as well for you. Now several years ago, I fished a bass tournament down on Lake D'Arbonne in northern Louisiana. And during the practice day before the tournament, I was trying to locate some fish in a shallow flat that was located between 2 creek channels. Ideal spot. Now I caught plenty of fish in this same area the previous year, almost to the same date, and the water and the weather conditions were just about the same. I tried a variety of baits in various colors: plastic worms, spinner baits, crankbaits, topwater, grubs, jigs, but nothing worked. Then I switched to different size baits and experimented with the speed of retrieve and the depth control. Still nothing produced. But later that day, when I went into the marina, I saw an old gentleman out on the end of the dock cleaning some crappie, and he had several nice bass. I walked out to him and I bragged about his fish, and I asked him how deep he caught them and what he'd used for baits. Well, minnows, he replied. But as I watched and talked while he cleaned 3 of the larger bass, I noticed that every one of them had a 2 to 3 inch crappie in their stomach. Now the following day, I went back to that same flat and tried casting a 2.5 inch solid white crankbait. Several casts, well, it failed to produce a strike. So I took a dark waterproof lure paint pen marker and put small blotches all over the white crankbait to resemble the coloration of the small crappie. My second cast earned a chunky 3-pound bass, and within 2 hours I had boated and released a dozen fish in the 2 to 4 pound class. Of course, on the other end of the lake, this tactic may not have worked at all, But obviously, the main diet of the bass in the area where I was fishing was small crappie. Therefore, changing or tuning my lure to closely resemble this feed really paid off. There are many things that you can do to add to the action of a bait or modify their appeal without changing their basic structure. Bending, straightening, hooking, coloring, filling, sharpening, trimming, adding or subtracting sections, like putting a skirt on them or adding a trailer to them, making them weedless. It's really limited by your own imagination. But next time out, keep lure tuning in mind. It may save your fishing day, and it can't help but save you some pocket change. It wasn't too long ago, I was out on the lake fishing, and I referred to an object called a deadhead. Fisherman jumped up and said, "I've heard that term deadhead for years. What is it?" Well, a deadhead, also called a deadfall, is a fallen tree that has floated for some time. At some point, one end of a tree has become waterlogged and either sunk to the bottom or hung up along a ledge or in other submerged cover. This is an excellent isolated form of cover that can really produce bass for you. Deadheads can be located in many different areas of a lake, like out in a flat, wedged in a mass of timber, along a ledge, or whatever. But the best producers of fish will be deadheads that are isolated from other cover. Recognize that wind and current will shift deadheads around until they become dislodged and move, or they will sink from becoming too waterlogged. Consequently, they may not always be in the same place that you found them a few days ago. Any type of deadhead is an excellent place to locate bass, but a deadhead that is wedged along a drop is always better. Never pass these up. Single bass will hang around the exposed end near the surface, and concentrations of fish often hold in the thick cover below. Sometimes the deadhead will position itself in the opposite direction. Here you'll usually find the fish suspended in the heavier cover located near the surface. Now here's an additional tip that you'll want to remember. When the water begins to warm in the spring, bass will suspend around this cover because the surface water is warmer than the water below it, and the exposed end serves as a great ambush point where bass can attack bait fish as they meander by. What type of lures are best for fishing deadheads, you might ask? Well, there's several good lures to try. The time of the year and the water clarity will determine the choice. For muddy water during late spring and early summer, I prefer a buzzbait and a spinnerbait. If the limbs of the deadhead aren't too deep, a crankbait fished slowly is tops. In clear water during the spring and the summer, fish a crankbait parallel to the deadhead. Even try buzzbaits or spinnerbaits near the exposed top and a jigging eel or plastic worm deeper. In midsummer, the plastic worm is best in most cases. And don't overlook topwater baits early and late in the day and when the sky is cloudy. You know, I'm asked from time to time, what are key spots to fish when bass are in shallow visible bushes, those located way out in a flat, away from the shoreline? Well, it's important to keep in mind that new lakes and reservoirs will have bushes in them for many years to come, but these will eventually rot away. And until they do, in flood control lakes, the water will rise each spring, covering many of them and a portion of the shallower ones. However, during low water years in many of the old wide floodplain reservoirs, or say the upper reaches of the lakes that do fluctuate some, these dry flats will crop new stands of bushes referred to as secondary growth. Now, in fishing areas of this type, depth is very important. If you locate bass at 2 to 2.5 feet, for example, you can be sure that the majority of active bass in that area will be found in just about the same depth range. Forget about the bushes shallower or deeper than this. For this area is the area that you want to concentrate on. Forget about what's going on the other side of the lake. It could be a completely different story. This situation may be entirely different, and more than likely it would be. And don't overlook the fact that bass are likely to move to different depths at different times of the day and varying weather conditions. Early and late and on cloudy days, the bass, for instance, might even be found in bushes only a foot deep. But later that day, during periods of harsh sun, they'll move in tighter or up under the cover, or they'll drop out into a little bit deeper depth. One should concentrate on the depth where he's catching fish, because that's where others will be. When this plays out, change depths, but keep on chunking. Another important note that it's very common to catch bass out to the side of a bush, say 3 to 4 feet away. This usually occurs early and late in the day and during cloudy conditions when there's no shade line extending from the bush. As the sun gets higher, bass move in closer to the bush. It's always smart to first cast out a few feet beyond and to the side of the bush, then begin working in to the cover with each successive cast. On bright days, let's say after 10 o'clock in the morning, it's best to work both sides of the bush before casting over the top or directly into it, because it could hold several bass. By casting over or into it first, you could spook any others holding there or nearby. The clearer a lake, the more important shade and shadows can be. As the sun swings around during the day, bass will change positions, and they will continue to reorient their position as the shadow line moves. It's not that the bright sunlight hurts the fish's eye, because they possess a black pigment not present in the human eye that shades the photosensory cells of the retina, causing them no discomfort, but rather allowing them the advantages of semi-darkness to be able to see their prey much better. Always remain alert and give some thought before making your first cast. If the water's choppy or if it's off-colored, the bass should be in real close, very, very tight on the bush. And it should be fished the same way that you'd fish it on a cloudy day. Always remember to work your lure from out to in, which will avoid spooking other bass. Fine-tuning the pattern fishing technique is a real key to success, and you must be alert to recognize patterns within patterns. Fishing any kind of fish can certainly be viewed as a game of odds. You know, you start out fishing along the shoreline as soon as you drop your boat in the water, and you go along there and you make you a couple of hundred casts and only catch a small fish. Well, those kind of odds make for a long, long day. You know, or you will soon learn that the majority of your casts will not produce fish, but trial and error fishing directed toward establishing a pattern can help reduce significantly the number of no-catch days. Now, if you find a pattern or two, you'll find fish, no matter what the day brings weather-wise. Again, pattern fishing is just cutting the odds of that 200 to 1 shot. The fine point of pattern fishing is being able to recognize a pattern within a pattern. Now, don't just go crazy and get your brain in a backlash. Finding a pattern within a pattern is merely fine-tuning basic pattern fishing. That is, discovering that the fish are holding in bushes is one thing. But which bushes? Are the bushes buckbrush? Are they elbow bushes? Are they willow bushes? Are they way in the back end of a cove? Are they out on a point? Are they back in the flooded woods along a sand, mud, or gravel bank in 2 feet of water or deeper? Or are they isolated? These are numbers of questions that you got to ask yourself, and you want to pinpoint where the action is. The more questions you ask, the more you'll ponder and the more answers you'll come up with. When this happens, you'll definitely be on the fish. Also, you must constantly be alert to places that overlap fish holding factors. This is known as multiple structure, and it cuts the odds in your favor. For instance, a stump or a treetop might hold a fish, or several fish, and so might a point. But a stump sitting right smack dab in the middle of a point might really be a smokehouse. How about a fall down, a treetop, let's say on a channel bend? Each one of these factors alone may produce fish, but the two factors together might make it a day you'll never forget. Two combinations of structure factors are potentially endless. Paying sharp attention to what combinations exist where the fish are found is a quick key to identifying subtle patterns within patterns. Lure preference is critical. Type, color, and depth plus retrieval speed. To discover the best lure, change frequently and keep experimenting with size, color, type, and depth until something clicks. Most important to remember is that practically anyone can learn to cast a lure out and work it back. But knowing where to cast it, well, it means the difference in catching or not catching. And I don't mean tree limbs. One last word of caution. It's equally important to realize that patterns change from early to midday, from late evening, and even at night, from day to day, season to season. What worked yesterday or last month or even a year ago is only a good starting point to unlocking today's secrets. Discover the pattern regardless of the species and you'll find fish. All fish are in patterns. Did you know that water temperature dictates fish behavior and movement in a big way, especially in the spring of the year? And did you know that water temperatures will normally begin to warm up in mid-January to late February in southern Georgia and Florida? In the central part of the country, let's say from central Alabama to southern Kentucky, water begins to warm up by mid to late March. And farther north, temperatures will usually start from mid-April to mid-May. Naturally, this depends on how early the spring or how severe the winter and how long it lasts. If certain areas of the country experience a cold late winter, these times can vary a few weeks or more. A New York fish doesn't know he's a northern fish, nor does a Florida fish know he's a resident of the Sunshine State. What controls his behavior and movement greatly in the early spring is one major thing, and that's water temperature. Now, if you had to guess, what area or part of the lake will warm up first in early spring? Would you say the shallower portions, or would you say the deepest part? Or how about the southeast, or northwest, or northeast, or southwest section of the lake? If your answer is southeast, I'd quickly say wrong. But if you said northwest, you'd get an A+. Northwest is the correct answer, especially the shallower portions. The reason is because this section is protected from seasonal northwest cold winds. The angle of the sun is lower on the horizon at this time of the year. Therefore, there's much more sunlight and less shade on the northern shore, which will increase water temperatures anywhere from 3 to 6 degrees or more. The added sunlight and warmth in this area of the lake enriches the water, plant life, plankton, which provides food, oxygen, forage, and cover for fish most of the time. Think of old Mr. Sun as a giant heater which keeps the life cycle going. I'm on the move, especially during the spring, flying here and there, and it's just about to wear my arms out. No, seriously, I do a lot of traveling at this time of the year, flying to different places, and I'm always looking at lakes below. I always get me a window seat and trying to look, see everything that's going on, especially when we're flying over a body of water. And one thing that I've always noticed, that during the spring, the northwest coves and pockets of a lake invariably appear greener or darker first, which indicates a bloom is taking place as a result of warmer water. Fish in these areas will be most active because fish by nature are cold-blooded creatures, and their body temperature is the same as the surrounding water. Many fishermen normally think the shallowest part of a lake will warm up the quickest, but this is misleading, for being shallow is no guarantee that it will warm up the fastest. However, if the shallowest section happens to be in the northwest part, be prepared, because you're in a prime location for early spring fishing. This little tip has paid off for me more times than I can count. How important is water temperature during the summer months on the activity and feeding of the largemouth bass? Well, the answer is that water temperature is an often overlooked but important element of successful fishing. The angler who understands the effects of heat and cold on his prey and the lake is helping put the odds in his favor. Many anglers don't realize that water temperature has a drastic impact and dictates his behavior during all seasons, and summertime is certainly no exception. Bass are most active within a certain temperature range. Anything above or below that range greatly decreases activity and feeding. Scientists have determined that bass prefer water between 70 and 80 degrees. As the temperature moves into the mid to high 70s, bass activity increases to as much as 15 hours a day. But after 80 degrees, what fish biologists call the avoidance level, activity drops off. At 85 degrees, it's less than 8 hours a day, and at 90 degrees, it's down to about 4 hours per day. Bass in many of our semi-shallow lakes tend to feed in the shallows, which of course heats up more quickly than the rest of the lake. When the water's around 70 degrees, the bass will go into the shallows to feed. When the temperature gets above 80 degrees, they'll stay out, preferring to return at night when it's cooler. Now, research makes a pretty good case for summer night fishing. Studies have shown that when the water temperature is on or in the low 70s, 40% of the fish activity is in the evening. But at 82 degrees, as much as 70% of the activity occurs after dark. This is especially true of clear water. So the next time you head out to your favorite spot, you might just want to include a thermometer or a surf temp on your boat. It's difficult for us to tell the difference between 85 degrees to, say, 90 degrees. All we know is it's pretty warm. But a bass can detect a degree change because they're cold-blooded creatures, and their body temperature is governed by the surrounding water around them. In other words, their body temperature is the same as the water that you hooked him in. Now, I hear a question quite often: does water temperature have a bearing on the size of the fishing lure you choose to use? Well, yep, that's a good question, because warmer water increases a fish's metabolism to a point, while colder water slows it down, making him less active. In warmer water, he'll feed both more often and more aggressively. He digests his food faster and tends to feed on larger bait fish too. That's why bigger baits or lures are so much more productive. So during the summer, the fall, and the early to mid-spring, I lean toward bigger lures. Bass do become very selective in their feeding during these times of the year. I've seen schooling bass bunch up on a point, say 15 feet deep, and refuse a 6-inch worm and just clobber a 11-inch worm. As the water begins to turn cold, so many anglers feel that smaller lures work best. Well, I personally prefer larger ones, and I fish them very slow during this time of the year when that water chills. Their metabolism starts to slow down, and in cold water, they're very sluggish. They require much less oxygen, less food, and their digestive rate is very slow, and they don't exert much energy in chasing a lure. Fish hooks are one of the most critical aspects of the tackle system, regardless of the fish one seeks. When you consider that there's 50,000 variety of hooks available, it becomes obvious that difference of opinions exist. The most important rules for any hooks lies in its ability to penetrate easily. Wire diameter is another factor. The lighter the wire, the easier it'll be to push it in and through the skin right into the mouth of the fish to get a good hook set. Now, fishermen have always had a tendency to use too large a hook. Many believe that the huskier size will hold better, or that it's not important to match hook size to the task. It's easy, most of the time, to shrug off a missed strike, but it can usually be traced right back to the hook. Many anglers, this one included, file the barb just a tad to help penetration, because no hook is sharp enough as it comes out of the box. You'll increase your catch ratio if you work on it with a file or a hone. If a species has a soft mouth like the crappie, the bluegill, or the yellow perch, a larger wire hook will generally open a bigger hole, and it makes it easier for the barb to back out. On the other hand, if you're using heavy gear for heavy fish and you want to apply pressure, well, you got to resort to a stouter hook so that it won't straighten. Now, in artificial lures, hook sizes are an important part of the balance. If you change treble hook sizes, be sure to check the balance carefully. The plug may not have the same action with the replacement. Selecting the correct hook can be as critical when fishing natural bait also. In some instances, the hook should be buried inside the bait. Several patterns are made for this task. When live bait is used, wire diameter and size becomes very critical. Too large a hook deprives the bait fish of its ability to swim effectively. Pick a hook that will present the bait in the most natural manner. Here's something you might find interesting: the number system, which serves as a guide so you can compare hooks within a given pattern. The higher the number, the smaller the hook. Size 20 is smaller than size 2, for example. When the size reaches 1, the process is reversed, and the aught is added. Thus, a 4/0 is larger than a 1/0, and so on. Hooks with a deeper bite seem to have more holding power on big fish. Keep priorities in mind, however. If you're using relatively light tackle, or if the species is well known for having a tough mouth, say like that of the catfish, your primary concern should be penetration. Holding power has little validity or value. Before you buy hooks again, take the time to analyze your needs and then ask for specific patterns and sizes. It's worth the effort to concentrate on every hook and to match it to the task. There he is. Come on. Ooh, that's a better fish here. God, nice. Come on back here. Where are you going? That is a good fish there of about, what's that trailer hook? 4.5, 5-pound fish. Most cypress trees have a root wad that southern fishermen call the donut. The donut is a circular wad that surrounds the tree and extends out from the base about 3 to 5 feet, and then about 1 to 3 feet from the base of the tree to the inside edge of the donut. Some trees, especially those in very shallow water, have roots growing out as far as 8 to 10 feet from the outer rim of the donut toward deeper water, and this is a key area to fish. But most fishermen think only of the base of the tree and move their boats right over the roots and the fish. This overhead view of a cypress tree gives you an idea of how a tree and root system should be fished. Begin with a cast close to the tree. Make the next cast about 3 feet from the base, while at the same time trying to feel the outside of the roots with the lure. Make several casts to the area because it can pay big dividends, without question, big dividends. After covering the right side, fish the left side in the same manner. Always cast beyond the tree in order to cover the back, the side, and front, all during the same cast. Next, thoroughly make a series of fan casts, fishing the roots that extend farther out. Keep casting to the left as long as you feel the lure sliding through the roots. Now, move to position 2 and make casts which cover the right outside edge of the donut, the base of the tree, the left side of the tree, and finally, the left side of the donut. When I fish a cypress tree this methodically and don't earn a strike, well, I'm convinced that there's no bass there at all. But until the lure reaches my rod tip on the final cast, I have confidence that a bass is there. Now, look at this drawing. Keep in mind that when a bass is feeding, it can be almost anywhere close to the tree, from the base on out to the extended roots, or even 15 to 20 feet off the tree. But you'll save valuable fishing time by fishing only the 5 key areas shown in this drawing. Another tip for fishing shallow water in a cypress line lake is that about 75% of the time you'll find that the outer trees are much more productive than the inner trees, naturally unless the lake level's high. And isolated trees are also a good bet. One old tree just sticking out there by itself. And it's always smart to check for irregular features like a ditch or a depression leading back into the shoreline. The trees along it will normally be the best. This type of feature is not always present, but I can tell you this, it can be one of the best spots in the entire lake. Oftentimes, by just reading the tree formations, you'll be able to detect this type of feature. The tree lines they'll give it away just by watching for the irregular turns of the actual tree line itself. Let's talk about fishing an unfamiliar lake. Now, as you well know, that would be almost impossible unless we had a day or two to do it. So let's talk about some quick things you can do when fishing an unfamiliar lake that might help you catch a few more fish you might not have otherwise caught. An unfamiliar lake may be one that you fished for a number of years and never really taken the time to learn, or it could be a body of water that's completely new to you and one that you're going to try for the very first time. Some outdoor writers often refer to this situation as fishing a strange lake, but I believe that there's nothing strange about any lake that harbors bass. It's all a matter of mental attitude. Even some of the finest bass fishermen sometimes experience difficulty on new waters because they're overwhelmed by the new and unfamiliar surroundings, thus failing to place the problem in its proper context. Now, If you think for a moment, you'll realize that there will be many similarities between the new water and your favorite bass lake. Equally important, you can expect the bass to follow the same habits and seek the same habitat if the two lakes are fairly similar. Just because the physical layout of an impoundment changes somewhat doesn't mean that the characteristics of the species undergoes a major change. If you've analyzed the new lake carefully, you already know that bass will seek a preferred depth based on water clarity, pH, and temperature. Add to that the requirements for food and cover, and it shouldn't be too difficult to locate some fish. All that's left to do is find the structure and the features of the new water that are most likely to hold bass. And one of the easiest places to begin your search would naturally be the shoreline, especially if it's a lake you only have a short time to fish, or a lake you may not fish again for some time. Maybe you're there as part of a vacation trip, or a business excursion, or there for a bass tournament. You may even be the type who doesn't enjoy fishing structure in deep water, preferring to do your bass catching along the shoreline. The shoreline of an unfamiliar lake is basically the same as any other length of shoreline. However, it will have special features on the shoreline, a few feet off the shoreline and several yards off the shoreline, and your job is to recognize these features. By fishing tight to shore, you can waste a lot of time dropping a lure along every stump, stick up, or log along the bank. Sure, you might catch a bass or two scattered here and there, but look at how much time that takes. Now, I don't want to imply that you're making a mistake fishing that way, because it can be and is an enjoyable way to fish. But I prefer to find several fish off one spot rather than a single fish. And I know many anglers that feel the same. They, like me, enjoy fishing near the shoreline. Now notice I said near the shoreline, not necessarily right up against it. I prefer to look for something out of the way. Something hidden beneath the surface in the form of an irregular feature. And with the help of a map and a depth finder, I'll spend some time seeking out these locations. First of all, any point extending out into the lake is always a good place, but some points are better than others. Take a look at this one. As you see, there's nothing really special about it. The point has a gradual slope with no distinct break. Look at the interval lines, how much they're separated. The point has no cover and would not be a good area to spend much time fishing. But look at this illustration. Well, it's a completely different story. The actual shoreline point is not that attractive. It's a little dumpy round job, but the underwater portion of this point extends out and forms a 5-foot deep secondary point with a fast 15-foot break on the left side, which is an excellent holding area. What makes this area even better is the channel that skirts in next to it. It's called a channel secondary point and can be one of the finest points you can fish. Notice the location of the fish. They're relating to the sharpest part of the break line. It's important to remember that the tighter the interval lines, the quicker the drop. And a good map will show you these hideaways. Moving right along, let's look at another great holding area close to the shoreline. As you move down the bank, it's very important to be observant and keep an eye open, not only for transitional changes in the shoreline, changing from one composition to another, like rock to sand or mud to clay or sand to mud, but elevational changes. In this diagram, we see a bluff or high bank changing into a flat. This is very visible on shore because we can see it. Well, underwater, it does exactly the same thing. Deeper water runs in close to the bluff bank, and much shallow water on the flat bank. On the bluff bank, look at the distance from shore to 20 feet of water. Now, look at the distance on the flat bank. Shorelines of this type are located on most lakes all across the country. All you need to do is find them, and when you do, you've found a crackerjack spot. Here, bass will usually position themselves along the transitional zone, where they have the comfort of deep water to their left and an excellent shallow water feeding flat to their right. Now look at this one. It's a key spot just off the main lake point at the mouth of a shallow cove where a deep water cut comes in from the open water area and runs in close to the left point. A couple of other interesting things about this location is that there's no other key structural feature close by. The shoreline to the left and to the right is nothing more than a plain Jane sloping bank. Anytime you can locate an isolated feature like this, more times than not, you've uncovered an excellent fishing hole. Another unique feature is the fast break on the upper left side of the deep cut. Where the fish are located, look how close the interval lines are together. Nowhere else in the entire area is there a faster break. Here's another excellent location you'll find on many shorelines, a submerged pocket just off the bank a short ways. It too is isolated with shallow water surrounding about 180 degrees of it with good access to deep water in front of it. Single bass moving up and down this shoreline will locate an area of this type, and when they do, they'll usually hold up here and join up with other bass using it. This is the kind of place where schools of bass are formed. These little out-of-the-way places that we've looked at for the past few minutes are close to the shoreline, but not necessarily right on it. It requires more work than fishing the obvious shoreline features, but it's enjoyable work, and that's bass fishing, and as you well know, there's no shortcuts to success. Have you ever taken a youngster fishing with you? Well, if you haven't, there's no better time than now to do it. And there's no better place for the child's first fishing trip than a pond that is overstocked with bluegill or catfish or small bass. Youngsters need to have their enthusiasm kept up, and catfish, bass, and bluegill will certainly do that. The size of the fish isn't really that important to the child, but the catching is. Take along just one rod. It'll be enough, believe me. You'll be as busy as a raccoon in a garbage can just helping your young angler fish. Something else you want to take along, which you won't find in any tackle box, is a pretty large portion of good old humor and a big slice of patience. The child, whether yours or a neighbor's, will be trying hard to do things right. They want to please the teacher, but they'll need lots of help. For instance, helping a child rig his or her rod or helping a child cast a bait may at first seem just a little frustrating, but it can also have some lighter moments if you bring along your sense of humor. Catching that first fish will require more patience from you than it will the child. Trying to get the lure out to the right spot usually isn't very easy for the little ones, so you'll have to help. Then after the line is out, they'll probably want to bring it right back in as fast as they can so they can cast it again and wondering all the time why a fish hasn't hit it. Children can get easily distracted when fish don't cooperate fast enough. They quickly find that it's a lot of fun throwing sticks and rocks out into the lake or maybe even splashing the surface of the water with the tip of their rod. When this begins, and it will, remember the words patience, patience, patience. Then that first fish tugs on the line. That's when the real fun begins. You may have to help hold the rod or even help him reel the fish because you're going to have one pretty excited youngster about this time. A young child can't be expected to be able to even come close to doing some things correctly in the beginning. Care must be exercised in how the young, budding angler is helped and guided. You might even be lucky enough to be developing a wonderful lifetime fishing partner. Look back on your own life. Remember that special someone who took the time to teach you and to share with you the many enjoyable outdoor experiences of your youth. That person holds a very dear place in your heart, I'm sure. A child's life is patterned after that parent, friend, or neighbor who took the time to provide the personal direction a child so desperately needs while growing up. And there's probably no better way than fishing to learn the real values of true sportsmanship and develop cherished relationships. Well, there you have it, and I surely hope you've enjoyed this last hour, and most of all, learned a new trick or two, which will help you catch not just one big fish, but many big ones in the years to come.